TTT News. Amanda T. McIntyre is a Trinbagonian author, artist, and advocate focusing on cultural studies, research, and literary scholarship. Now, her works explore Caribbean sociopolitics through recollecting and reconceiving mythologies and oral histories. We're very happy to be having this conversation with her this evening. Good evening, Amanda. How are you?
Good evening, DK. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm working on it, thank you. But for our jump-off point, I want to say congrats on your newly published work, Queer Baby Doll Family in Trinidad and Tobago's Carnival. And it's in volume 34 of the Caribbean Writer. I'm asking though, what does it cover?
Thank you. This was an essay I co-authored with Yarula M.I. Wegner. He's a researcher from Frankfurt, Germany. And we looked at Carnival as a platform for feminist and queer interventions. One of the observations we made from looking at the history of the Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago with a focus on the baby doll masquerade was that even though queer bodies and queer LGBT, even though queer bodies have always been present in Carnival, the positive representation of queer culture was largely absent. Of course, through the years, there have been representations. There was a baby doll presented by Stephanie Leach in 2010. That was Leslie, the lesbian baby doll that was roaming around looking for a wife to help her mother the doll child. And another queer representation was The Dying Swan, presented by Peter Minshall, Ras Nijinsky, and Dragas Pavlova. And certainly that was the largest scale on which it was done. So one of the points I wanted to make was about making spaces of heteronormative leisure more accessible to queer youth. And this was in response to the Jones judgments, Jones versus TNT, that decriminalized same-sex sexual practice. So on the heel of that judgment and on the heel of this long tradition of non-positive representation of queer culture in Carnival, we worked on a performance that was titled You Are Worthy, and it engaged Carnival as a platform for feminist and queer interventions. And the essay, which we co-authored, deals with that and looks at feminist interventions as parts of the way in which Carnival could be used now by advocates in the Caribbean.
Now, is there a specific reason that you decided to say, okay, well, we're going with baby doll as the focal point or the frame of reference to drive this research?
Well, I have been performing baby doll for 10 years now. The first time I did it was in 2011. One of the reasons I chose the baby doll is because of how much it meant to me personally in terms of my personal history. But for this performance, it made a lot of sense because in the early movement of Carnival, and by that I mean the late 19th century, I shouldn't say most, but really all of the female masquerades were performed by men. So there was a great amount of transvestism in Carnival, which I found really ironic because even though there was so much transvestism that was positively received, queer culture was not positively received. So it was very ironic. And on that irony, it was interesting for us to use the baby doll, one of the female masquerades originally performed only by men, to be performed but within the context of a queer family. So while I was obviously read in the performance as a woman, Yarula, who partnered for that performance, was read as a woman as well. On closer inspection, because he kept the beard, even though we were veiled, audience, and by audience, Carnival spectators would read that it was a woman with a man dressed as a woman, and in that way confirm two things: confirm lesbian family life from a distance, and on closer inspection, confirm transgender family life. So in this way, queer culture represented in Carnival, but represented in a positive way and in a way that promotes healthy mental awareness for viewers in terms of how they perceive themselves and an understanding that they are well received and cared for, just as the doll child is cared for within this family.
And that makes me want to speak the name of Tony Hall, who would have spoken about inhabiting an energy when he spoke specifically to the Miss Miles character. But we won't go there right now. We're jumping back to the baby doll because we saw a post that you shared with Hazel Brown. And I'm wondering what to you is the role of protest in Carnival and how do you continue that energy throughout the year outside of the mass?
Well, I'm glad that you brought the name Tony Hall to the conversation because Tony was really instrumental in my mass development in terms of how I present my mass. Years ago, I did a workshop with him, and one of the things he said that stood out to me related not just to Carnival, but to protest culture in Trinidad and Tobago. And that was whatever you do, it has to be on a large scale. It can't be just that you recognize it, but somebody from a distance, a mile away, they have to be able to see this thing. And not just that they should be able to see it, but they have to immediately understand what you are trying to say. And that is one of the things that I have kept throughout my career in Carnival. And I see how this is related also to my career as an advocate, because if we examine the culture of protest in Trinidad and Tobago and in the Caribbean, it's so much like our Carnival celebrations to the point where there are jokes being made that, Trinis like to make everything a fete, Trinis like to make everything a party. And while these things are meant in ways to criticize how protests are conducted, I wouldn't critique it because what it does is it shows how much related our protest culture is to our Carnival culture, which is a very good thing. Because what we do is we get a message to be seen by a myriad of persons, to be received immediately, and to have change that is hopefully long lasting and far reaching.
And also to me that brings up the question. Some people say all them good to do is make old mass or play mass, but as you say it and as I'm thinking about it, it boggles my mind how individuals are not able to appreciate how someone can make a statement that is so profound with just a few words. And like you said, you're supposed to be able to latch on to what the meat of that message is from however far distance you see. And you get all of that, and it needs to be condensed in such a form that somebody can get it in those first few seconds.
Yes, that is really the beauty, I think, of Old Mass. Old Mass is a particular genre within Carnival. And originally called Old Mask, it was used in the early movement of Carnival and in this contemporary movement as well as satire. So persons would either decorate themselves or carry a placard or do boards to comment on some issue that is of present importance. So the audience is able to see this thing, immediately relate to it, understand that there is a message. Part of the beauty of Old Mass as well is that there's so much humor to it. It's taking a very serious thing and treating it in a comical way. So years ago, when the Bocas Literary Festival did their first Old Mass competition, I performed in that, and in that year I won. So I'm an Old Mass champion, and I'm very proud of that. and all of the performances that I've done in Old Mass and in these last years of Carnival, they have all been protest mass. So this last performance with the baby doll, which I did this year, was called Dolly Ma. And last year we did You Are Worthy, which is what the essay in the Caribbean writer is about. And throughout the performances for the Bocas Literary Festival, in the first year I did an overview of the feminist movement in Trinidad, in which I played a baby doll as well to commemorate the amendments to the Marriage Act that discontinued the legal marriage of children, which was one of the big wins in civil society that year. And in the following year, I did LGBTQI LAND, LGBTQ Island, because that was the year of the Jones judgments. And um, last year we did every creed and race. And I really, I still feel very emotional talking about every creed and race because what we wanted to do was welcome migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers to the island because at that time there was such a drastic increase in the amount of Venezuelans here, and the wider public was not receiving it very well.
And in terms of receiving it, we continue this conversation after taking a short break. We are speaking with Dolima. We are speaking with Old Mass Royalty, Amanda McIntyre. Stay with us. We return with more. Welcome back. We are speaking with Amanda McIntyre. It is said that the true measure of an individual is how they treat someone who is not able to do something for them or someone they may not interact with. So when we stopped, Amanda, you were speaking about welcoming migrants to our shores. And I want you to continue that thought and then carry it into the Black Lives Matter protest. Thank you.
Right. So in 2019, in the first quarter of 2019, the registration of Venezuelan migrants began, and the way in which it was conducted brought us back to the question of the necessity of protecting refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. One of the things that the presence of Venezuelans, in particular in Trinidad, brought to the fore was just how xenophobic our culture is. And I was really dissatisfied with that. So I wrote this Old Mass because immediately after Carnival, in addition to what was happening with Venezuelan migrants, there was also a re-emergence of the Buck folklore. And this was covered heavily in the media. The Buck folklore originated in the early 1980s, and in that folklore, a person, very short, miniature, is brought to Trinidad illegally from Guyana. This is the myth. I'm using illegally within the context of the myth. Is brought into Trinidad and is exploited for labor. And what I identified was that this was a folklore that not only included migration, but a folklore that continued to be driven by that idea. So throughout the years, it still remained that this was a migrant. And even in 2019, when the myth resurfaced, the Buck at that time, the Buck, declared itself to be a Jamaican. And this happened around the same time as the great national debate was taking place about the legitimacy, I use legitimacy in quotes again, legitimacy of Venezuelan migrants and migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in Trinidad and Tobago. So I made a connection between migration, myths, and mass, looking at cross-cultural exchanges that take place within Caribbean migrations. So the Old Mass, representing every creed and race, was as a result of that thought process, and I continued writing around it and doing research around it, which I presented in Jamaica at the Rex Nettleford Arts Conference last year, the paper Migration, Myths and Mass, which I further developed and will be presenting at the end of this month at the Literature Conference hosted by the University of the West Indies.
So we look forward to that and congratulations on that again. But answer the person who says, why pick a struggle like Black Lives Matter that is happening in the United States when so many things are going on locally?
Well, first of all, that is correct. Many things are going on locally. And it's important for us to acknowledge that because I can see how a lot of the press back, a lot of the pushback that civil society gets is exactly that reason. You know, people want to know, why are you focusing on this when I am suffering so much? Why are you focusing on this when I have this immediate problem, you know? So the pressure is always how to manage multiple things at the same time. The Black Lives Matter movement was very important from inception and remains important because of just how disenfranchised African heritage people have been and continue to be, not only in the United States, but all around the world. I mean, great, important, iconic scholarly works have been written about this. I mean, most immediately coming to mind, and I think a lot of people would know, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. So what happened with George Floyd in the United States, in which he was killed by law enforcement officers in Minneapolis, just resurrected the Black Lives Matter movement, not only in the United States, but with great mobilization around the world in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and, and against neo-fascism in the United States as represented in the person of Donald Trump and his policies. And in Trinidad and Tobago, of course, this was very important too. But here, our situation receives a depth of complexity in that, in addition to racial prejudice, we have a lot of class struggle here as well. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we find that we have to always distinguish when we say Black Lives Matter, that we are talking specifically about persons who receive particular oppressions. Yes, people and the disenfranchisement that they receive on account of race. But when we observe, when we examine what happened in Morvan with the 3 Morvan killings, we understand it is not only about race in Trinidad and Tobago, it intersects with class as well. So the situation here does have that complexity. When the movements resurrected in the United States, there was a lot of fallout locally from prominent businessmen and businesswomen, I should say business persons, with them sharing the hashtag All Lives Matter as a sort of contradiction to Black lives. And of course, people eventually came out as saying, well, they didn't understand, or they didn't know this, or they didn't know that. But coupled to this were really terrible statements that reflected just the ways in which they thought about their fellow citizens of African heritage, and in which they thought about people who just don't belong to the same economic group that they belong to. So,
and it's interesting though that when many of the texts that these individuals subscribe to look and see, okay, well, yes, people are suffering. These are the things that affect everyone, but special care is made to address the needs of those who are suffering more than others. But it seems as though it's okay to look at it in one with one lens there, but at the same time, when it applies a little closer to home, is as no, is something totally different. But we have about 1:30, again, 1 minute and 30 seconds. But that whole Black Lives Matter, that conversation, and a lot of the energy that was going with that could not just happen on one day, one protest. You all have moved the conversation forward and are moving it forward. So in that 1 minute, please tell me about Rock the Boat 868.
Well, this was a platform developed by myself and Abeo Jackson. It's a pre-recorded podcast that we host bi-monthly, dealing with matters of national, regional, and international importance with regards to sociopolitics, with a focus on Caribbean scholarship. So topical, of course, in our last episode was election 2020. So we dealt with matters of leadership, matters of statesmanship, matters of why some persons are not fit to be leaders in Trinidad and Tobago, and just going deeply into that as feminist thinkers, pro-Black thinkers, pro-queer thinkers, anti-capitalist thinkers. So if those are the things that you are interested in discussing or in hearing discussed, then Rock the Boat is certainly a platform that you can tune into.
And how do people tune into that platform?
Right now, it's very difficult to tell because we only just started, you see. I can tell you.
Or let me ask you differently. How do people tune in? Do they go to YouTube, IG, Facebook? Where do they get that podcast?
Right. Well, the Rock the Boat 868 podcast is largely found through its electronic hashtag. So once you go onto any platform, Facebook, YouTube, IG, Twitter, and you hashtag Rock the Boat 868, we will appear.
All right. So thank you very much for that and the time, Amanda T. McIntyre. And as you say, in closing, a Luta Continua. So,
Luta Continua.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the entire news team, I'm DK Roster. Thank you for joining us. Good night.